This video contains Arcane spoilers, obviously. Hi, I'm Thomas, and I love exploring the relationship between art and technology. And while I normally talk about art and tech in video games, I think the two come together beautifully in the hit series Arcane, Fortish's latest visual masterpiece. After I watched the show, as a real-time artist, I was really curious to learn how they created their iconic environments. It was pretty obvious that they were using tricks by blending 2D and 3D to get the looks that they wanted. So after watching the show over and over again, I feel like I have a decent grasp on some of the crazy techniques they may have used, and I wanted to share with you guys what I learned in the hopes that you might learn something new for your own projects as well. Either way, Fortiche did some really insane stuff that I think anyone interested in the show will find really cool. To support the development of these videos, come support me and my puppy on Patreon. She's extremely needy and needs the attention. So Arcane features a ton of different environments, and some of you have probably noticed most backgrounds are actually just 2D painted billboards, also known as matte paintings. Almost every shot in Arcane has some sort of 2D painted background in it. For instance, this opening shot of Piltover, or this opening shot of Zon, the Undercity, are all mostly 2D paintings with a bunch of 3D assets in the foreground, but we'll talk more about those 3D assets later. Fortiche has a large team of digital painters working in their company, and you can see from their previous work in La Gaviota and Rise that they heavily employ the use of these digital paintings to help set them apart from other production studios. Ironically enough, a lot of these 2D images that you see most likely start off in 3D software. By first creating the rough scene in a 3D software, you can then quickly paint over the render. This is called a paint over. This is a very common technique used by concept artists to work out perspective, shadows, and lighting, and comes in very handy when you need to draw the same environment at multiple angles, which you see all the time in Arcane. Now, I'm not saying that this show is all 2D. From my analysis, most of the foreground and midground are typically 3D assets, or at the very least are using a few really interesting tricks, which I'll explain in a bit. Overall, I found some of these shots are incredibly complex and layered, and are a very delicate and deliberate balance of 2D and 3D, and use a lot of really cool camera perspective tricks and VFX. Speaking of VFX, all of the VFX, and I mean all of it, was drawn by hand in digital painting software by a team of just 4 to 5 VFX artists. And if you guys end up enjoying this video, I can definitely do a full analysis on the VFX of Arcane as well. There's so much to talk about, and I love VFX. Oh, and speaking of VFX, if you want to learn more about creating environments, you can check out my Unreal Engine course in the description. I'm currently working on a free add-on for the course that teaches you how to create a really simple and beautiful water shader with a foam VFX that actually looks like it's hand-drawn. So, for a quick recap, some shots are all 3D, some shots are all 2D, but most shots lie somewhere between these two extremes. But how did they blend it together so well? Well, I have a few theories based on some research and my own experimenting. Now, Fortiche didn't exactly have the biggest budget for Arcane when it comes to these massive studio productions in comparison, so they had to be creative and efficient when working on their environments. One of the quickest and cheapest ways to create textures for environments is to project 2D textures onto 3D geometry. This is called texture projection, and it's clear that Fortiche employs this technique pretty heavily. For instance, that scene when Silco is sitting in that child's room, his shadow is projected up on the wall, and you can see he's got different angles of geometry, even though the background looks 2D. That's because it was most likely projected onto simple 3D geometry. From my observations, the more distance the camera has to travel, typically the more 3D has to be used in that shot. So instead of having to meticulously hand paint every single 3D background, artists can actually take part of the already created matte paintings and project some of the textures onto rudimentary geometry to give the scene more believability and depth. From there, to add some more detail, they can manually go in and paint the extra details in to blend it into the scene better, which saves a ton of time. Texture projection most likely wasn't really used for key environment shots, just scenes in the background you normally wouldn't pay too much attention to. But then again, we haven't seen a breakdown, so I could be wrong. Fortiche didn't just project 2D paintings onto 3D geometry. They also projected 2D textures onto simple 2D planes. This use of 2D planes in a 3D environment in the foreground and midground reminds me of those old sets that use painted pieces of wood to simulate a 3D object like bushes and trees, like when you'd go to like your kids' play or something. You're so good. Good girl. Good girl. The camera. I suspect most things that you actually think are 3D in Arcane are just 2D planes, especially if there is only a little bit of camera movement. Now, this really is just speculation because it is almost impossible to tell. The artists at Fortiche did such a great job matching the 3D texturing with their 2D matte backgrounds. I really believe this technique is subtly used all over Arcane. There are hundreds of examples of it. This scene of this steampunk-ish car is really interesting to me. The original matte painting, which I tracked down from the concept artist, is originally completely 2D. But there's a ton of movement in this scene. It's either been projected onto a 3D object, which it doesn't really look like it has, or it is just a 2D image that has been masked out and splined. If you remember those League of Legends launchers of all the new champions that released, you know what I'm talking about. I also suspect that they are recompositing the characters back into some scenes that use just 2D backgrounds. However, to do this, they would need some really accurate lighting on the 3D models. Again, it's hard to confirm whether this is true or not, but it can definitely be done. The Firelight tree scene is a really good example of this. You have 3D characters flying around and disappearing behind this tree, but they're simply being masked behind a massive 2D object. That tree is not 3D, it's 2D. There are other great examples of this, like masking of characters into backgrounds to integrate them into the scene. This scene from Victor's childhood is another really great example. I've tracked down again the concept art so you can see how the characters are composited into the scene and how the VFX of the waterfall is used to add another layer of believability and depth. There are even some scenes in Arcane that seem to me to be full-on 2D paintings. Now, they are either 2D paintings in planes in a 3D space like we talked about earlier, but it's more likely they just masked out and spline animated the image in something like After Effects, which is a pretty easy effect to do and people have been doing it for years. The scene is a really great example of what I'm talking about. There's nothing really 3D in here. The real hero here, and what ties everything together, is the lighting, which is done incredibly well for a studio that, to my knowledge, technically has no dedicated lighting department, according to my research. Since the lighting is painted into the backgrounds and onto the characters, the lighting on the 3D assets and characters needs to be perfect or else it would just look strange. So here's something really interesting I found. To help the characters blend into the 2D shots better, they're most likely using a really cool perspective trick in the projection of the image to make it look like the painting is actually 3D. Do you remember those crazy 3D sidewalk drawings you used to see as a kid? When you moved slightly to the left or the right, it looked really stretched out, but when you looked right at it, it looked like someone was sitting in a 3D pit. Well, if you stretch out an image over a long plane, from the right perspective, it creates this amazing optical illusion where you can integrate 3D objects on a 2D plane.
Good girl. Thank you.
I believe this is happening in quite a few shots where characters are moving around a bit in the still shots. A lot of this is given away during the camera movement, and Fortiche has really done a great job at hiding some of these imperfections, which made my job making this video very difficult. For example, this Enforcer's shadow gives it away in this quick shot. His shadow should be warping a little bit with the rocks beside him, but it's cleanly projecting over what seems to be a 2D image. You'd never really notice these details unless you were really looking for them. So yeah, Arcane was pretty good.